the well and knew for certain this water would kill her. And another half-block away, a 5-year-old girl drew water from the well and raised the mug to her lips. He knocked the mug out of her hands. The girl started crying, and he looked at the well and knew for sure this water will kill her. And another half-block, a minute before that, he was lying face down in brown sludge. It was moving, thickly, slowly, as if alive. It tossed him right onto the stones, onto unfamiliar stones on an unfamiliar pavement. He raised his hands to his face and froze. These weren't his hands. Thin, young, with a callus from a pen on his finger, someone else's. Somewhere to the right, a woman was yelling at a goat, words he didn't know, but he understood them. A stone gutter hung overhead, pouring that very sludge straight into an open drain. The drain ran along the street toward the well. The ditch of sewage flowed toward the drinking water well. And then his brain did what it always did. It forgot about the strange hands. It forgot about the nausea. He forgot that he didn't understand where he was or how he'd gotten there. He looked at the ditch and understood. In a week, the whole neighborhood would be lying here. The cesspool sits higher than the well on the slope. The gutter pours into the open drain, a drain with no settling tank, no bend, no chance of self-cleaning. Dan Corvin, 29 years old, a hydraulic engineer from Portland, 6 years with the municipal water department, and now he's kneeling in medieval mud, angrier than he is afraid. Who designed this? No one. He stands up. His legs are shaking. The clothes are unfamiliar. A canvas shirt, pants held up by a string, shoes made of such junk that the left one is already soaked. He takes 3 steps and grabs the wall, breathing through his mouth. He can't breathe through his nose. The street is narrow. The roofs of the houses almost touch. The sun doesn't reach here. From the window across the street, someone is emptying a chamber pot. The stream hits 5 steps away. The splashes reach his shoes. An old woman's face flashes in the window. She isn't even looking down. And right then he recognizes this scene. Not from life, from his own lectures. He himself had told his students about the Great Stink. About the Thames, which stank so badly that Parliament hung wet sheets over the windows. About John Snow, who proved that cholera spreads through water and not through bad air. Only this isn't London. This is worse. In London, at least there were pipes. Here, there is nothing. He walks along the street and counts. A habit. He counts the houses, wells, cesspools, distances. 100 paces, 3 wells, 7 cesspools. Not a single well is higher than the cesspools in elevation. All 3 are poisoned, guaranteed. No analysis, no test strips, just by the slope. Water in the ground flows downward. Mud from the cesspools seeps into the aquifer. The aquifer feeds the wells. People drink. People get sick. People die. And no one understands why, because no one knows that water flows downward. He stops at the last well, peers inside. The water is high, murky, with a rainbow film on top. He recoils. And then he sees her, a girl of about 5 with a clay mug. She has just filled it and is bringing it to her lips. No, you already know what happens next. He snatches the mug, pours it onto the ground. The girl wails, not out of fear, out of hurt. It's hot and she's thirsty. And a strange, dirty man has taken her water. A woman bursts out of the house across the way. She's large. Her hands are red. Her apron is wet. She sees her crying daughter and the stranger by the well. Her face hardens. She approaches quickly. She asks what he's doing, quietly, threateningly. The laundress's hands, red, cracked, strong. He says the water is poisoned. She looks at him as if he were mad, asks who he is. And right then he realizes he doesn't know the answer, doesn't know whose body he's in. He doesn't know his name in this world. He doesn't know the city, the country, nothing. He knows one thing. This well kills. And the 3 before it, too. He says his name is Dan, that he's not from around here, that he knows about the water. She asks what he means by knows. He replies that he knows why people get sick, and that it's not spirits or the wrath of the gods, it's filth. The woman is silent for 3 seconds. She picks up her daughter, she looks down at him, and says he'll explain inside. Otherwise, the guards will take him away because he looks like a vagrant. Moretta Holloway, laundress, widow, 2 children. The youngest is 5, the oldest is 17. Her husband died of scarlet fever 3 years ago. He learns all this in 10 minutes. The house is tiny, 2 rooms, dirt floor. A trough takes up half the space. It smells of lye and dampness, but it's clean. By local standards, almost sterile. She gives him water, from that very well. He doesn't drink it. He asks if she boils the water. She's surprised. Why? He sits down on the floor. His legs won't hold him. His body is hungry and weak. But his mind is working too well. He sees everything. How the house is built. How the street is built. How the system that kills people is built. And he knows how to fix it. Only he knows this. In the whole city. In this whole world. One person who understands why water flows down. A girl walks in the door, skinny, dark hair under a rag, a basket of wet laundry. She sees a strange man on the floor. She looks at her mother. Moretta says this is Dan and he knows about the water. The girl sets down the basket. She asks what he knows. Lena, 17, eyes quick and angry. He lifts his head and says he knows why her father died. Everyone freezes. Even the little girl in the corner falls silent. He says her father didn't die from the wrath of the gods, from the water, from that well. Because 10 paces up the slope, a cesspit is rotting, and everything in it seeps into the ground and flows into the well. Moretta says that's nonsense. The well has been consecrated by the priests of the 7 springs. Every month, a priest pours holy water into it. He asks if many people die after the consecrations. She is silent. Lena answers. Uncle Tom died a week after the summer consecration, and Aunt Brigitte, and the whole Crosby family, all after that. But that's because the fever comes in the summer. Everyone knows that. He nods. The fever comes in the summer because it's hot in the summer. The water in the wells drops. There's just as much dirt. The concentration rises. People drink more, drink dirtier, get sicker. It's not the will of the gods. It's arithmetic. Lena stands by the door. Her eyes are burning, not with faith yet, with curiosity. He asks for coal, a bucket of water, a rag. He gets down on his knees on the dirt floor and begins to draw. A street, house after house, well after well, pit after pit. Arrows showing where the water flows underground, where it comes from. The first sanitary map in the history of this world, with a piece of coal, on the laundry room floor. Moretta watches and doesn't understand. Lena watches and begins to understand. He pokes 3 points with the charcoal, 3 houses. He says that here, here, and here, in 9 days, the children will get sick, because that pit over there will overflow in a week. The rains have stopped. There's less water in it, but just as much mud. The concentration will skyrocket. It'll get into the well. The children drink more because they run around. The children are weaker because they're small. They'll get sick first. Moretta takes a step back. She asks what to do. He says one thing. Don't take water from this well. Carry it from the one farther away. The one on the hill. It's higher up. The pits don't reach it. The water is cleaner. Not perfect, but cleaner. She asks if it's far. 2 blocks away, with buckets, every day. He nods. Far, but the daughters will live. She looks at the little girl in the corner, at Lena by the door, at the map on the floor, and says she'll go to the distant well. He falls back onto the floor. He has no strength left. She brings a bowl of gray, bland porridge. He devours it in a minute. He lets her stay the night. 1 night. Otherwise, they'll definitely take him away. He falls asleep on the laundry room floor, a sack of straw under his head. It smells of lye and wet wood. And his last thought before sleep isn't about where he's ended up or who he's become, but about how the slope of the ditch on the street can be fixed in 3 days. It'll take 4 people with shovels, 3 days, 4 shovels, and 1 street will stop drinking its own waste. In the morning, a scream wakes him. Lena is standing over him, pale. She says the neighbor's boy is on fire. The 3rd day, his skin is red. His mother is already there. He gets up. His head is spinning. He follows her. In the morning, the street is different. More people, more noise, just as much mud. The 3rd house. At the door are Moretta and 3 other women. One is crying. He goes inside. On the mattress is a boy of about 7. His skin is covered in red spots. His eyes are cloudy. The heat is so intense it hits his palm from a distance. Scarlet fever. He knows what it is. Not by name, by the symptoms. High fever, rash, clouded eyes, something bacterial in the water. And he stands over the boy and knows there's nothing he can do. He's not a doctor. He doesn't know about antibiotics. He doesn't know the dosages. He knows how to prevent the next one from getting sick. But this one is already sick, and this one will most likely die. The mother asks if he can help. He says he's not a doctor, that he knows other things. The mother turns away. He goes out. Lena is at the door. She asks why he didn't help. He says he doesn't know how to heal. He only knows how to build. She asks what to build. He looks at the ditch, at the well, at the street, and says, "Ditch, which will save the next ones." She doesn't answer, but she doesn't leave either. This is Dan's 2nd day in Latran, the capital of the Kingdom of Velmeria, a city that is slowly poisoning its inhabitants with their own waste, a city where people pray against fever and burn incense against the plague, a city where, in 500 years, no one has ever looked at a map or asked where the water flows. Dan Corvin, hydraulic engineer, no magic, no weapons, no money, no papers, not a single acquaintance except the laundress and her daughter. But he knows one thing that no one else in this world knows. Water flows down, and that knowledge is worth more than any sword. The boy died on the 4th day. His name was Tobin. He was 7. His mother carried his body out in the morning, wrapped in the same sheet he had been lying on. The cart arrived around noon. The driver didn't come down. He sat up top with a rag over his face, hooking the bundles with a long hook. 4 bodies were already lying on the cart, 2 small ones. Dan stood by the laundry room window and watched. Moretta stood beside him. She was silent. Lena was in the yard. She was hanging up laundry and didn't turn around, but her hands were shaking. Dan stepped away from the window. He sat down on the floor. He picked up a piece of coal and began to count. He needed to keep his hands busy. He needed to stop thinking about Tobin. He needed to think about pipes, about gutters, about slopes, about what he could change. He drew on the floor and muttered under his breath. The street slopes from west to east, about 2%, enough for gravity flow. The gutter runs along the south wall of the houses, open, no bottom, no sides. Essentially just a furrow in the ground. Sewage from the houses flows into it through holes in the walls. The gutter leads to the intersection. At the intersection, it hits the wall of the tanner's house and spreads out into a puddle. The puddle is always there. Flies breed in it. Flies land on food, on the faces of sleeping children, on the water in open jugs. A closed cycle of infection. Classic. Dan had seen this in textbooks, in photographs from Africa and South Asia, in the slides of presentations he gave to students. Only now, he was sitting inside that slide, and it smelled. He finished the sketch, looked at it. The solution was simple, so simple that he wanted to laugh. The ditch needed to be extended, through the tanner's yard, past the wall, down the slope to the nearest ravine beyond the city wall, about 200 paces long, a cubit and a half deep. Line the walls with stone so they wouldn't collapse. Pack the bottom with clay. Place stone slabs on top. A covered ditch, a covered drain. The smell goes away. Flies don't breed. The puddle disappears. The infection is stopped. 4 men with shovels. 3 days of work. Stone can be gathered from the ruins at the edge of the block. There's clay on the riverbank. Slabs can be hewn from those same ruins. It's all free. All that's needed are hands and time. He stood up. Moretta looked at him. He said he needed 4 people with shovels. Moretta asked why. He explained. About the ditch, about the slope, about how if they extended the drain to the ravine, the puddle at the intersection would disappear, and with it, the flies would disappear, and with the flies, some of the diseases would go away. Moretta listened. Then she said she didn't have 4 people with shovels. She had herself, and Lena, and 1 shovel. Dan nodded. He said the 3 of them would start. Moretta looked at him for a long time. She asked if it would definitely help. Dan said it definitely would. No ifs or buts, because on this matter, he hadn't doubted for a second. Drains, slopes, gravity, it wasn't faith, it was physics. They started that very day. Dan marked a line with charcoal right on the ground, from the intersection across the yard, along the wall, down the slope. He worked slowly. His body was weak. Hands accustomed to a keyboard and a pencil were not ready for a shovel. After an hour, blisters formed. After 2, they burst. Blood mixed with the dirt. Moretta worked beside him, silently. Her shovel sank into the ground smoothly and deeply. She knew how to dig. She had been hauling water and washed clothes in tubs. Her hands were stronger than his. Lena carried stones, small ones, from the ruins on the corner. She piled them up next to the ditch. The neighbors watched, from the windows, from the doors. 2 men stood on the corner talking. One pointed at Dan and laughed, said the laundress had found herself a fool who was digging a ditch for her, probably for food. The second one replied that the fool didn't even know how to dig. Look how he's holding the shovel. They laughed. Dan heard them. He kept digging. By evening on the first day, they had covered 20 steps, out of 200. Dan was lying on the laundry room floor. His back was on fire. His hands were wrapped in rags that Lena had cut from an old sheet. Moretta was cooking porridge. Lena sat next to him and studied the blueprint on the floor. She asked how he knew all this. Dan said he'd studied. Lena asked where. Dan said far away, very far away. Lena asked if she could learn too. Dan turned his head and looked at her. 17 years old, skinny, hands covered in calluses. She'd never held a book. She had never seen a blueprint until yesterday. But her eyes were right, quick, hungry for knowledge. He'd seen eyes like that in students, in the best students. Once every 5 years, he'd come across one with eyes like that. He said she could. Lena didn't smile. She nodded, seriously, as if he'd signed a contract. On the second day, the first volunteer showed up. His name was Holt, 24 years old, a digger, broad-shouldered, silent, hands like shovels. He came over in the morning, said he'd seen them digging, said they were digging it wrong. The walls would collapse. You have to remove the top layer first, then dig deeper. Dan looked at him, smiled, for the first time in 4 days in this world. He said Holt was absolutely right and asked if he'd help. Holt shrugged, said he didn't have a job right now anyway. The owner for whom he'd been digging the basement had died of a fever. With Holt, the work went twice as fast. He dug so fast the dirt flew. Dan showed the direction. He marked the depth. He checked the slope. He used the simplest tools for this: a bucket of water, a long plank, and a stone plumb bob on a rope. He poured water into the trough and watched where it flowed. If it didn't flow, the slope was too shallow. If it flowed backward, there was a mistake. If it flowed forward, everything was right. Holt watched him. He asked who had taught him. Dan said that water teaches you itself. You just have to watch. On the third day, a woman joined them. Her name was Meg. She was the wife of the tanner whose yard the ditch ran through. She didn't come to help. She came to complain. She said they'd dug up her yard, that mud was splattering onto the drying hides, that her husband would be furious when he got back from the bar. Dan stopped. He stuck his shovel in the ground. He walked over to Meg. He asked if her children were sick. Meg fell silent. Then she said the youngest had been sick in the winter, but she'd survived. But the neighbor's child hadn't. Dan pointed out the puddle at the crossroads, that very one. He said that this puddle feeds the flies that carry disease, and that the ditch they were digging would get rid of this puddle. And that in a year, Meg's youngest wouldn't get sick again. Meg was silent for a minute. Then she went into the house. 10 minutes later, she returned with her husband's shovel, and she began to dig. By the 5th day, the ditch had reached the middle of the route, 100 steps out of 200. Dan sat on the edge and examined his work. The walls were crooked. The bottom was uneven. The stones lay haphazardly. Any inspector in Portland would have fined him. But the water flowed. He poured a bucket into the start of the ditch. The water traveled all 100 steps and flowed out onto the slope. It didn't stop. It didn't come back. It didn't stagnate. The slope worked. Gravity worked. Physics worked. He wanted to call someone and tell them. There was no one to call. He was sitting in a medieval town. His only crew consisted of the laundress, her daughter, a digger, and the tanner's wife. 4 people. 1 ditch. That was the beginning. By the end of the first week, what Dan had predicted happened. In the 3 houses he had marked on the map, the children fell ill. In the first house, a boy came down with a fever in the morning on the 8th day. A day earlier than predicted. In the second house, the mother took to her bed that evening. In the third, 2 children fell ill on the 9th day. Exactly as he said. Exactly in those houses. Exactly the children. Moretta was standing by the window when the news came. She looked at Dan and said nothing. Her face was strange, a mixture of horror and something else. She asked how he knew. Dan said he didn't know. He calculated it. The well, the pit, the distance, the time, the temperature. It's not a prophecy. It's an observation. Moretta didn't listen to the explanations. She heard only the fact. He said they would get sick. They got sick. He said they wouldn't get sick in her house if they drank from the distant well. They didn't get sick. She looked at him. Lena looked at him. Meg, who had come for the laundry, looked at him. Moretta's little daughter was playing in the corner, healthy, rosy-cheeked, drinking water from the distant well for a week now, alive. Dan saw the look on their faces change. It wasn't fear, not surprise. It was faith, and it frightened him more than the fever, because he knew the cost of a mistake made by the one they believed in. One mistake and faith turns to hatred. One mistake and everything falls apart. He is no prophet. He is an engineer. Engineers make mistakes. All the time. Every project is a chain of mistakes and corrections. But to these people couldn't be explained to these people. To them, he either knows everything or knows nothing. There is no middle ground. Dan closed his eyes, he sighed, and said they needed to finish the ditch. The next morning, 12 people were standing by the ditch, in silence, with shovels, buckets, bags for stones. Neighbors from those houses that hadn't gotten sick because they'd heard the advice to drink from the distant well. They didn't come because they understood the science. They came because their children were... Dan stood before them, dirty, with his hands bandaged, in a torn shirt. He looked at them, nodded, and told them where to dig. The ditch was finished in 2 days, 200 paces long, a cubit and a half deep, stone walls, a clay bottom, stone slabs on top. The puddle at the crossroads disappeared within a day. There were fewer flies after 3 days. The smell lessened after a week. It wasn't pretty. It was crooked. The stones lay unevenly. The slabs didn't match in size. Water seeped out of the cracks here and there. But it worked. Water flowed from the houses down the slope toward the ravine. The sewage no longer pooled at the intersection. The air became cleaner. A little, but noticeably. And Dan stood at the intersection. He looked at his ditch. The first sanitary facility in the history of this world. Crooked, skewed, built by a laundress, a digger, a tanner's wife, a 17-year-old girl, and an engineer from Portland whom no one here knew. He allowed himself to smile for 3 seconds. A month had passed. Moretta Street had stopped burying people. Not quite. An old man from the lower end died of old age, but no one died of fever. For the first time in 3 years, not a single child, not a single mother, not a single father. The rumor spread through the lower city like water down a gutter, fast, downhill, without stopping. People began to come to Moretta Street, not one at a time, in groups. They stood by the ditch, they examined the stone slabs, they sniffed the air, they shook their heads. They asked who had done it. Holt answered, briefly. He pointed at Dan. Dan, meanwhile, usually sat crouched somewhere against a wall, sketching on scraps of leather. Moretta got him scraps from clients. Paper in this world was as valuable as copper. Leather was cheaper. Dan sketched plans of the neighborhoods on the leather scraps. He measured slopes, he calculated distances. His tools were the same, a bucket, a board, a stone on a string. But now he had an assistant. Lena walked with him every morning. She held the string. She counted the steps. She wrote down the numbers. She wrote them down. Because Dan had started teaching her. The first thing he showed her were numbers. Not letters, numbers. Because an engineer doesn't need letters. An engineer needs numbers. Lena got the hang of it in 3 days, counting to 100, adding, subtracting. On the 4th day, Dan showed her fractions. She struggled for 2 days. Then she understood. Her face, when she understood fractions, was such that Dan turned away. Because he recognized that face. He had seen it in the mirror 20 years ago. When in 10th grade, the physics teacher explained to him why water swirls down a drain. It was the face of a person who saw for the first time that the world has logic, that things don't just happen for no reason, that they can be calculated, predict, construct. Lena was as hungry for this knowledge as a starving child is for bread. She asked questions, endlessly. Why does water flow down? Why is mud heavier than water and sinks? Why does water stop smelling bad when you heat it? Dan answered, in simple words, without technical terms. Because there were no technical terms in the local language. He made up words on the fly. He called a slope the Earth's incline. He called filtration straining through sand. He called boiling cooking water until it bubbles. Lena memorized everything. 2 weeks later, she herself explained to a neighbor why you shouldn't wash laundry in the same trough where they wash vegetables. She explained it correctly. Dan listened from around the corner and almost cried. He didn't cry, but it was close. By the end of the first month, Dan's crew consisted of 4 regulars. Holt dug, Meg hauled rocks and made sure the neighbors didn't dump trash back into the close. Lena did the calculations and drew up the plans. Dan himself did the design work. Plus, Moretta fed everyone. It wasn't payment. Moretta simply cooked porridge in a large pot and set it by the door. Whoever worked, ate. Those who didn't work could eat too, but they felt ashamed. The system worked better than any contract. In the 5th week, the first problem arose. Not a technical one, a political one. A man in a gray raincoat came to see Dan, short, with a neat beard, with a silver pendant on his chest, a 7-pointed star, the symbol of the Order of the 7 Springs. He introduced himself as Brother Walden. He said he'd heard about the ditch, that the street's residents had stopped getting sick, that it was wonderful. Dan waited for more. It came. Brother Walden asked if Dan would like to come to the temple and tell the brothers how he'd done it. Dan looked at him, read his face. A polite smile, cold eyes. It wasn't an invitation. It was a probe. Dan said he was glad to be invited, but he was busy right now. A lot of work. Walden nodded. He said, "Of course, work is important. Let Master Dan know that the Order is always happy to help those who care for the health of the townspeople." And he left. Dan watched him go. Moretta stood nearby. She said quietly that the Order doesn't just show up like that. If they came, it means they noticed. If they noticed, it means they'll be watching. Dan nodded. He knew. Every monopoly reacts to competition the same way. First, reconnaissance. Then, an offer of cooperation. then pressure, then destruction. It worked the same way in Portland and in Latrine. The only difference was in the methods. In Portland, they took him to court. Here, they were apparently sending in mercenaries. But for now, the order was just watching. Dan had time. A little. He used it. In the 6th week, Dan built his first sand and gravel filter. It was so simple he was almost embarrassed. A barrel. Coarse gravel at the bottom, fine gravel on top, sand on top. Another layer of fine gravel on top. Water is poured in from the top. It passes through the layers. It comes out the bottom through a hole. The dirt. The dirt stays in the sand. The water doesn't become sterile, but it becomes much cleaner. Clean enough to cut the incidence of disease in half. He set up the filter by the well on the corner, the very same one, the one he wouldn't let the girl drink from on the first day. He explained to Moretta how to clean it. Every 3 days, remove the top layer of sand, rinse it, put it back. Change all the sand once a month. Moretta remembered. Lena wrote it down, on a scrap of leather, in numbers. 3 days, top layer. 30 days, all the sand. It was the first technical documentation in the history of Velmeria. Crooked, charcoal, on a scrap of leather. But documentation. The neighbors looked at the filter with suspicion. The water flowed in murky from the top and came out clear from the bottom. It looked like magic. One old woman said it was witchcraft and that they burn people for that. Meg told her that they should burn people for such nonsense too, but for some reason they don't. The old woman fell silent. Meg knew how to shut people up. Dan appreciated that. By the end of the 2nd month, there was a covered ditch on Moretta Street, a filter on the well, a rule about boiling water that 2/3 of the families followed, a rule about washing hands that 1/3 followed, a rule about not emptying chamber pots out the window that nobody followed. The last one was the hardest. People were used to it. 500 years of habit aren't broken in 2 months. Dan realized he needed a different approach, not a ban, but an alternative. You can't tell a person not to do what they've always done. You have to give them something better, simpler, more convenient. He started thinking about a toilet. Not a full-fledged one, the simplest. A hole, a seat, a lid, a pipe draining liquid into a ditch. The key invention, a water seal. A bend in the pipe where water collects and keeps the smell from coming back. The simplest thing. But no one in this world had thought of it. Because to do that, you have to understand that a smell isn't just a nuisance. A smell is a signal. Where there's a smell, there's poison. Where there's no smell, it's safer. Dan started sketching. In the 3rd month, Holt came to see him, not alone, with 3 men. They were from the next street over, 2 blocks away. The fever was raging there. 2 men had lost their children that summer. The 3rd had lost his wife. Holt brought them in silently. He said only one thing. Make one for them too. Dan looked at them. 3 men, big, with rough faces. One with a scar across his eyebrow. Another missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The 3rd with eyes so full of such longing that Dan couldn't look at them. They didn't ask. They stood and waited. The way people stand who have already lost everything and have nothing left to lose. Dan said he would do it, but he needed their help, their hands, their time, their shovels. The man with the scar asked how much it would cost. Dan said it was free. The man didn't believe him. He asked again. Dan repeated it. Free. The man was silent. Then he said that nothing in Latrine is free. Dan replied that ditches are. They didn't get the joke, but the next day they came with shovels. Now Dan had 2 projects going at once. Moretta Street, where he needed to build toilets and install filters on the remaining wells, and the neighboring street where they had to start from scratch, with reconnaissance, with a map, with measuring slopes, with explaining to people that water flows downhill. He split up the crew. Holt and 3 new guys worked on the new street. Dan came in the morning. He laid out the plans. He explained. He left around lunchtime. After lunch, he worked on his own street. Lena ran back and forth between the 2. She carried notes. She counted stones. She checked the slopes with a bucket of water. She'd learned to do it just as well as Dan. In the evening, Dan sat on the laundry room floor and taught Lena to draw. Not letters, blueprints. A line is a wall. 2 lines side by side are a ditch. An arrow is the direction of the water. A cross is a well. A circle is a cesspit. Lena drew on scraps of leather. At first, crooked, then straighter. By the end of the 3rd month, she could draw a map of the neighborhood from memory with an accuracy of 2 steps. Dan checked it. He walked with a rope. He counted. He compared it to her drawing. A margin of error of 2 steps out of 100. For someone who didn't know numbers 3 months ago, it was impossible. But Lena did the impossible every day, simply because no one had ever told her that she could. One evening, Lena sat next to him and was drawing. Her little sister was asleep. Moretta was doing laundry in the next room. It was quiet. Lena looked up and asked if she would be drawing for the rest of her life, or if it would end when the ditches were ready. Dan looked at her. He said that if she wanted to, she would draw bridges. Lena didn't understand. She asked what kind of bridges. Dan said any kind. Stone, wood, across rivers, across ravines. Because anyone who knows how to calculate a slope and draw a plan can build anything. The ditch is the beginning, not the end. Lena lowered her eyes to her drawing. She was silent. Then she said quietly that no one had ever told her she could build bridges. They told her she would wash clothes, like her mother, like her grandmother, like all the women on this street. Dan didn't answer. He just handed her a new scrap of leather and a new piece of charcoal. Lena took it and began to sketch. Ira Wellington saw Dan for the first time at the market. She was selling herbs, dried mint, chamomile, St. John's wort, lavender in bunches, everything laid out on a piece of cloth on the ground, between the fish stall and the meat stall, the cheapest spot. She was sitting on an upside-down crate, back straight, chin up, hands folded in her lap. The Baron's daughter selling at the market. Everyone knew. Everyone was whispering. Ira pretended not to hear. Dan came to the market with Lena. They needed lime for a new section of the ditch on the next street. The dry stone walls wouldn't hold water. They needed mortar. Lime plus sand plus water. The simplest cement. They walked through the rows. Lena knew the market. She showed the way. Dan stopped at one of the stalls, not at Ada's stall, at the stall across from it. They sold water there, holy water, in clay bottles with a 7-pointed star. The seller was a young novice in a gray cloak. There was a line of 5 people in front of him. Each bought a bottle, paid a copper coin. The novice blessed it and handed over the bottle. Dan stood and watched. He knew what was inside. Water from the so-called holy spring, the very one that belonged to the Order of the 7 Springs. He didn't know yet that the spring was poisoned. That would come later, in 2 years. But he already knew that no prayer could purify the water. He watched as a woman holding a sick child in her arms handed over her last coin for a bottle that wouldn't help at all, and he clenched his fists. Ada was watching him. She saw his face. She saw his fists. She saw how he looked at the novice. And she became curious, because at that market, everyone was looking at the tray of holy water with hope or indifference. But this dirty man in work clothes was looking with fury. She didn't approach him that day. She remembered his face, and asked the fish vendor who he was. The vendor said he was that madman who digs ditches in the lower city. He says that the ditches stop people from getting sick. A fool. Ira thought he was an interesting fool. They met again a week later. Dan was at the market again. This time he was buying clay, good clay, for a water trap. He needed the kind that wouldn't crack when it dried, rich, malleable. He stood at the potter's counter, kneading the clay in his hands. He tried one, another, a third. The potter watched him with irritation. He asked if Dan was going to buy some or just keep kneading it. Dan explained that he needed a certain density and malleability. The potter didn't understand those words. Dan tried to explain it more simply. He said the clay had to hold the shape of a tube and not break when it dried. The potter said all his clays held their shape. Dan said not all of them. This one would crack in a week, but this one will last a year. The potter asked how he knew. Dan squeezed a piece of clay in his fist. He opened his hand. He looked at the imprint. He said it was because of how it compresses and how quickly the edge cracks. Ira stood behind him. She listened. When Dan left with a sack of clay on his shoulder, she approached the potter. She asked who that man was. The potter said the same thing as the fishmonger, the madman from the ditches. Ira bought a jug from the potter, not because she needed a jug, because she wanted to think. She thought for 3 days. On the 4th day, she came to Moretta Street, alone, without a maid, without an escort. The Baron's daughter in the lower city. It was like walking into a cage of wolves in a silk dress. But Ira hadn't worn silk in 2 years. She was wearing a simple dress, dark, practical. She looked like a street vendor. It was on purpose. She found Dan by the ditch on the next street. He was standing knee-deep in a hole, explaining to Holt where to place the stones. Ira stopped. She watched. Dan noticed her a minute later. He asked how he could help. Ira said she wanted to understand what he was doing. Dan said he was digging a ditch. Ira said that she could see that. She wanted to understand why. Dan climbed out of the hole. He looked at her. Her speech was different. Not like the people of the lower city. Her words were more precise. Her sentences were more structured. She was educated. He explained, briefly. Dirty water causes disease. The ditch carries dirty water away from the houses. Less dirty water near people. Fewer diseases. Era listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she asked one thing. She asked why, if it was that simple, no one had done it before. Dan said that people didn't know. They thought diseases came from gods and spirits. Era nodded. She said she had read a book by an old doctor from the Eastern Empire. He wrote that the cleanliness of the body is linked to the health of the body. He had been burned as a heretic 200 years ago. Dan froze. He asked what book it was. Era named the author. The name meant nothing to him. But the fact that in this world, 200 years ago, someone had already been thinking along the right lines and had been killed for it told him a great deal. He asked who she was. Era said she was Era Wellington, the daughter of Baron Wellington. Dan didn't know who Baron Wellington was. It showed on his face. Era smiled for the first time in a long while. Because everyone in the train knew Baron Wellington. They knew he'd gambled away his fortune. They knew his daughter sold goods at the market, and everyone looked at her with pity or with contempt. But this man simply didn't know, and he didn't care. She said her father was a baron with a mansion on the eastern slope. The mansion was falling apart. The basements were flooded. The roof was leaking. There was no money. Dan asked what had flooded them. Era said water, groundwater, every spring. Dan thought. He asked which slope the house was on. Era said the eastern one, below the palace hill. Dan nodded. The eastern slope. Groundwater flows down from the hill. The house stands in its path. The basements collect water like a reservoir, a classic drainage problem. He used to solve these in Portland once a month. He said he could drain the basements. Era asked how much it would cost. Dan said for free, if the Baron would let him work and provide the materials. Era looked at him, for a long time, with that look she got when she was trying to figure out whether to trust him. She'd grown up at court. She knew there was no such thing as a free service, that every gift was a debt, that every favor was leverage. She asked what he really needed. Dan thought for a moment. He said he needed someone with a title to tell the king that the sewers were working, because a laundress's word wouldn't reach the king, but a baron's word might. Era looked at him. He was honest. He didn't pretend to be selfless. He didn't put on a show of nobility. He spoke plainly. I need your vote. In return, I'll drain your basement. A fair exchange, clear. Era held out her hand. Dan shook it. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. 3 days, Dan was standing in the basement of the Wellington mansion. The Baron was upstairs. He hadn't left his study. He was drinking. Era stated this without emotion. Just a fact. Father drinks, ever since Mother died. The basement was large. Stone walls, stone floor. The water was ankle deep, green, smelling of mold. The walls were wet. Fungi were growing on them. Dan walked through the water. He looked around. He counted. He touched the walls. He searched for the source of the leak. He found it. 3 spots. Cracks in the east wall. Groundwater was seeping in through them. Not in a gush. Slowly. Constantly. Enough to reach ankle deep in a week. Knee deep in a month. The solution was simple. A drainage ditch along the outside of the east wall, deeper than the basement floor, filled with gravel. Water from the ground would drain into the ditch and flow down the slope. The pressure on the wall would drop, the basement would dry out. Plus, the cracks needed to be sealed, with clay and lime. Not perfect, but it would hold. He explained it to Ira. She listened. She asked questions, smart questions. Not like Moretta, who asked if it would help, but technical ones. What depth, what kind of gravel, where to get it, how to calculate the slope. Dan answered, and with every answer he saw how she was memorizing it. She wasn't taking notes. She didn't have paper or charcoal. She was memorizing, in her head, structurally, like someone accustomed to learning. She asked where he'd been educated. Dan said far away. She asked in the Eastern Empire. He said even farther. She didn't press him. She accepted it. The way one accepts things that don't need an explanation right now. Ira brought 3 workers, former servants of the mansion who had stayed because they had nowhere else to go. They began digging the drainage ditch the next day. Dan supervised. Holt came to help on the second day. The work took 5 days. A ditch outside, gravel, a slope, filling the cracks inside. A week later, the basement was dry. For the first time in 5 years. The Baron went down to look. He was thin, with red eyes, with trembling hands, but he went down. He stood in the dry basement. He touched the walls. They were dry. He turned to Dan, asked who he was. Dan said he was an engineer. The Baron didn't know that word. Dan said he was a builder, who builds for water. The Baron nodded, was silent, then said that his father's wine had been stored in this basement. The best wine in Latraine. When the water came, the wine was ruined, and something else along with it. He didn't finish his sentence. He went upstairs. Ada was standing by the stairs. She saw her father sober and standing for the first time in a month. She didn't say anything, but Dan saw her eyes. 2 days later, Ada came to him with a proposal. She said her father agreed to talk to people, with other nobles, with merchants. Baron Wellington, impoverished and semi-disgraced, but still a baron. His word carries more weight than that of 100 laundresses. If Dan would work, then Ira would speak. Explain, persuade, translate his language into the language of those who make decisions. Dan asked why she wanted to do this. Ira answered briefly. She said that all her life she had been taught to be beautiful and to keep quiet, to be useful and inconspicuous, to get married and disappear. She asked his opinion on the matter along the way from the market. He was the first person to ask her opinion, on a real matter, not about the color of the ribbon, not about the dinner menu, about the ditches, about the water, about life and death. And she wants this to continue. Dan nodded. He said he was glad, and that he needed someone who could explain to the Duke why he should spend money on ditches. Because if Dan explained it himself, the Duke would kick him out. Ira smiled. She said she knew how to talk to dukes. She'd been taught that for 15 years. Now, finally, she'd have a chance to put it to use. From that day on, Ira became part of the team. She didn't dig. She didn't haul stones. She did something else. She talked. To merchants who complained about the smell. To the wives of officials who feared. With the aides to the counselors who decided where the city's money would go. She spoke their language, with their intonations, with their words, and she wove into her speech what Dan had told her. Not about slopes and filters, about health, about children, about trade. She said that neighborhoods with ditches don't get sick, that merchants would return there, that land there would go up in price. She spoke the language of profit, because the aristocrats didn't understand the language of health, but everyone understood the language of money. And it worked. Slowly, but it worked. By the end of the 4th month, Dan had 3 neighborhoods under construction, 17 people in the crews, 2 ditches, 4 filters, 1 water closet, the first in history. It stood in the courtyard of the Wellington mansion. Simple. A wooden seat over a pit, a clay pipe with a bend, a bucket of water for flushing. Era used it. She said it was the best thing that had happened to this house in 5 years. The Baron used it. He said nothing, but he stopped going out to the courtyard to the cesspool, which was an answer in itself. In the 5th month, Dan met Sora Khan for the first time. He didn't know who she was. She came to Moretta Street in the afternoon, alone, in a dark, hooded cloak, short, thin, with a narrow face and black eyes that looked so intently you wanted to check if there was any dirt left on your face. She walked along the ditch. She stopped, crouched down, touched the stone slabs, lifted one, looked inside, sniffed, put it back, walked on. She stopped for a long time by the filter. She examined the layers. She poured water on top. She held her palm underneath. She caught a trickle. She sniffed. She tasted it on her tongue. Dan watched from the laundry room door. He knew she wasn't your average curious person. Average curious people don't taste water from the filter. Average curious people don't lift manhole covers. He walked over. He asked if she was looking for something. The woman turned to him. She pulled down her hood. An Eastern face, high cheekbones, black hair tied in a bun. Around her neck, a thin silver chain with a lancet-shaped pendant, a doctor's symbol. She asked if he was the one who built this. Dan said he was. She said she wanted to ask him a few questions. Dan nodded. They sat down on a bench by the laundry room wall. Lena brought water from the filter. The woman took the mug. She looked at the water, then at Dan. She asked why the water was clean. Dan began to explain about the layers, about the sand, about the gravel, about how particles get trapped in the pores. She listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she asked the next question. She asked how he knew that dirty water causes illness. Dan said he'd observed it. People who drink from clean wells get sick less often. People who drink from dirty ones get sick more often. If you remove the dirt, the disease goes away. If you bring the dirt back, the disease returns. It's a pattern. The woman nodded. She said she had observed the same thing. For 7 years, in the palace, among the servants, those who drank from the upper well got sick less often than those who drank from the lower one. She wrote it down. She showed it to her colleagues. Her colleagues said it was a coincidence, that illnesses stem from miasms, that the upper-class servants were healthier because they ate better. She argued. They called her stubborn, then strange, then dangerous. They stopped calling her to the councils. Dan listened. He learned the story. Not this specific one, the general one. The story of a person who sees the truth and cannot prove it. Because the evidence is there, but no one wants to look. He asked her name. She said, Sora Khan, royal physician. Dan showed no surprise, although he was surprised. A royal physician. On a street in the lower city, by the gutter, tasting water from a homemade filter. He asked why she had come. Sora said she'd heard about the neighborhoods where people had stopped getting sick, that she'd checked the records, that she'd compared mortality rates by district. In Dan's neighborhoods, the fever mortality rate had dropped 8-fold in 3 months. In the rest of Lower City, it remained the same. This was no coincidence. These were statistics, and she wanted to understand how he had done it. Dan invited her inside. He showed her the drawings, everything, on scraps of leather, on the dirt floor, maps of the neighborhoods, diagrams of ditches, slope calculations, Lena's notes with numbers and check marks. Sora stood in the middle of the laundry room and looked at the floor, at the walls, at the scraps of leather hung on a rope like laundry. She was silent for a minute. Then she said that this was the most important thing she had ever seen in her life. Dan didn't grasp the significance of those words. To him, it was just a job, a map, a calculation, a plan. He did this every day in Portland. For Sora, it was a revelation. For the first time, someone wasn't just observing the connection between filth and disease. Someone was taking action, building, changing, and could show the results in numbers. She asked if he knew what was in the dirty water, what exactly causes the disease. Dan said he knew the general principle. Creatures live in dirty water that are so small the eye cannot see them. They enter the body through the mouth, through the hands, through flies that sit on the dirt and then on the food. They multiply inside the body. The body fights back. If it's strong, it wins. If it's weak, it loses. Children are weaker. The elderly are weaker. The hungry are weaker. That's why they die first. Sora listened. Her face didn't change, but her hands clenched on her knees. She said she had read something similar in a book from the Eastern Empire, written 300 years ago. The author described invisible creatures in putrid water. He was declared a heretic. The book was banned. She found the only copy in the palace library, hidden behind a shelf of prayer books. Dan asked what was in the book. Sora said the author described how water from ditches gets into wells, how people who drink from clean springs live longer, how cities on hills get sick than cities in the lowlands. He didn't know the reason, but he saw a pattern. 300 years ago. Dan nodded. He said that this man was right, that the pattern exists, that the reason lies in those very invisible creatures, and that he, Dan, cannot show them because he doesn't have the right equipment. But he could show the result. Neighborhoods that don't get sick, ditches that carry away the dirt, filters that purify the water. Sora asked if she could come, to observe, to take notes. Dan said she could. Sora stood up, pulled up her hood, walked to the door, stopped, turned around, said one thing. She said that for 7 years she had been the only person in this town who saw the truth, and all those 7 years she thought she was going mad. Because if you're the only one who sees what others don't, it's either genius or madness. And when everyone around you says you're mad, you start to believe it. But now a man with a ditch and a filter had come and proved she wasn't mad. That water kills. That dirt kills. That it can be stopped. And that's worth more than any title. She left. Dan was sitting on a bench. Lena stood nearby. Moretta was in the doorway. Lena asked who it was. Dan said it was an ally, the most important one they could have. Because Sora Khan has access to the palace, to the records, to the statistics, to the king's ear. She had been alone for 7 years. Now there were 2 of them. From that day on, Sora came every 3 days. She came incognito, in a dark cloak, unaccompanied. She was afraid her colleagues would find out, that the order would find out, that the court would start asking why the royal physician was going to the lower city. She came and took notes. She had paper, real paper, expensive, and ink. She wrote everything down. How many people lived in the neighborhood? How many wells? How many cesspools? How many fell ill before the ditch? How many after? The patients' ages, their genders, the distance from home to the nearest source of dirty water. She compiled tables. Dan looked at her tables and saw statistical analysis. Rough. Without a computer, without software, but statistical analysis. She saw patterns. She recorded them. She systematized them. He told her once that in another world she would be a scientist, a great scientist. She looked at him. She asked, in what other world? He didn't answer. She didn't press him. They discussed the data for hours, sitting in the laundry room. Moretta cooked porridge for them. Lena recorded their conversations because Dan asked her to. He said that everything they discussed had to be recorded because if something happened to him, the knowledge must not die. Sora asked what could happen to him. Dan said that the order had already come, that this was only the beginning. Sora's face darkened. She said that the order was influential at court, that the high priest, Cassian, had direct access to the king, that the priests controlled all the wells in the upper city, that their holy water wasn't just a business, it was the foundation of their power. If someone proves that holy water doesn't work but the sewers do, then it's not a medical issue, it's a political one. Dan nodded. He said he knew. That he'd always known that sewers were politics, that any change to infrastructure was a redistribution of power. In Portland, 3 contractors sued each other over the right to build a storm drain in a new neighborhood. And here, there are no courts. Here, there are knives. Sora said they needed to be more careful. Dan said he would be. He was lying. He didn't know how to be careful. He knew how to build. Caution was Ira's job, and now Sora's. In the 6th month, 2 things happened. The first, Ira introduced Dan to her father, officially. Baron Wellington was sitting in his study, sober, for the first time in a long time. The basement was dry, the toilet worked, the house didn't stink. The Baron looked at Dan and saw a man who had done what 3 magicians and 2 masons had failed to do in 5 years. The Baron said he would place an official order to drain the basements of 3 of his acquaintances, impoverished nobles just like him from the eastern slope. Basements just as flooded, the same problems. Dan agreed. It was his first official commission, with the client's name, with a document, with a signature, a small piece of paper bearing the Baron's seal. But still, a piece of paper. Legitimacy. The second incident was worse. During the night, someone had destroyed the filter at the well on Moretta Street. Stones were scattered. The barrel was overturned. Sand was strewn across the pavement. Dan arrived in the morning and stood over the wreckage. Moretta stood nearby. She was silent. Lena stood on the other side. His face was pale. Not from fear, from anger. She asked who had done it. Dan said he didn't know, but he had a hunch. Moretta said quietly that yesterday she'd seen a man in a gray cloak on the corner. He was standing there, watching. He left when he realized she'd noticed him. A gray cloak, a 7-pointed star, an order. Dan crouched down by the broken barrel. He scooped up a handful of wet sand. He looked at it. Then he stood up. He said they'd rebuild it in a day. Lena asked what if they destroyed it again. Dan said they'd rebuild it again. Lena asked what if a 3rd time. Dan looked at her. He said even 100 times, because they could break it every night, and he would build it every morning. And in the end, building would be faster than breaking, because it takes 1 person to break something. But there were already 17 of them to build. They repaired the filter in 4 hours. Holt brought a new barrel. From where? No one knew. Dan didn't ask. Meg brought stones. Lena poured in the sand. Moretta stood nearby, watching to make sure no one approached. The filter was back in place. It worked. Clean water flowed. No one came the next night, or the one after that. But Dan knew this wasn't the end. It was a pause. The order wasn't retreating. The order was regrouping. And next time, it wouldn't be a filter. It would be something else. Someone else. He went to sleep in the laundry room. Moretta slept in the next room. Lena in her spot by the wall, their little daughter between them. Dan lay there staring at the ceiling, counting. 3 blocks, 17 people, 4 filters, 2 ditches, 1 toilet, 1 ally at court, 1 baron with a wet basement and 3 friends, 1 enemy with a silver star on his chest, and 1 city that was slowly dying from its own filth, and from those who profited from that filth. 6 months. He had been here 6 months, and he was only just getting started. Summer came early. By the start of the 6th month, the heat had settled over the latrine like a wet blanket. The air was stagnant. It didn't move. The river had run dry and turned into a brown strip between banks covered with a crust of dried-up filth. The stench rose from the streets in waves. Even on Moretta Street, where the sewer was working and the filters were in place, it stank. Not like before, but it stank. Because one street's sewer can't save you from the sewers of the whole city. The filth came from outside, with the wind, with the flies, with people coming from other neighborhoods. Dan knew that summer was a test. Everything he had built over the past 6 months would now be put to the test. If his neighborhoods held up, it meant the system worked. If not, it meant he had made a mistake. And the price of a mistake was not a fine or a reprimand. The price of a mistake was dead children. He checked everything, every day. He walked through the 3 neighborhoods in the morning. He looked at the ditches. He checked the filters. He touched the stones. He sniffed the water. Lena walked beside him with her notebook. They marked every crack, every clog, every spot where a rock had shifted or a slab had sunk. They fixed it right away. They didn't put it off. Dan explained one thing to the crew. A ditch isn't a wall. You build a wall and forget about it. A ditch is alive. It only works as long as someone watches over it. One section gets clogged, and the whole system grinds to a halt. The water doesn't flow. Mud piles up. Disease returns. They have to check it every day, just like they check a stove, just like they check a door lock. Holt was the first to get it. He appointed himself in charge of the ditch on 2nd Street. Every morning, he walked from start to the end. He lifted the slabs. He cleaned. He put them back. Silently, without reminders. Meg kept an eye on the filters. She learned to change the sand herself. She explained things to the neighbors. She scolded those who poured slop into the well. They feared her more than the guards. Dan was grateful to her for that. Fear worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. In the 2nd week of summer, the first person in the Moretta neighborhood fell ill. An old woman from the upper end of the street. She was over 60. She lived alone. She got her water not from the filter, but straight from the well, because she didn't believe in that nonsense about sand, because she'd been drinking from the well her whole life and nothing had happened. She took to her bed in a day. Fever, red spots, cloudy eyes, scarlet fever. Moretta came to see her, brought clean water, rags. She changed her clothes. The old woman was delirious, calling someone by name, her son, who had died 5 years ago from the same fever. Dan stood at the door. He didn't go in. He couldn't help. He knew that. Knowing it didn't make it any easier. The old woman died 3 days later. Moretta closed her eyes. The cart arrived in the morning. A driver with a hook, a bundle on the cart, another one. Dan stood by the window and counted. 1 death. On a street of 32 houses. So far, just 1 all summer. Last year, 11 died on this street over the summer. He hated himself for counting, for turning death into a number. But he was an engineer. Engineers count. Numbers are proof, and proof is what will save the next street. He wrote it down. Lena wrote it down. Sora wrote it down when she came 2 days later. 1 death. A woman in her 60s. Didn't use a filter. Drank from an open well. The conclusion is obvious. Sora brought her records from the palace. City statistics. Dan looked at the numbers and felt a chill inside. In the lower city, 140 people had died in the first 2 weeks of summer. 1 in his 3 blocks. 139 in the rest. The proportion was monstrous. Sora said this couldn't be explained by coincidence. It couldn't be explained by prayers. It couldn't be explained by anything other than what Dan was doing. She said she would write a report for the Royal Council. Dan asked if they would accept it. Sora said she didn't know, but she would try. She left. Dan stayed. Lena asked what would happen if the council didn't accept it. Dan said that then they would continue as before, block by block, street by street, slowly, for a long time. But they would continue, because there is no other way. In the 3rd week of summer, what Dan feared happened. Red fever crossed the walls. People in the upper city fell ill. Not the servants, not the retainers, the nobles. The trade advisor's wife was the first to fall ill. Then the count's daughter. Then 2 garrison officers. Then an old mage from the academy. The upper city, which had considered itself safe, panicked. Because they had prayers, they had holy water, they had mages. And none of it helped. The fever came with the water, with the flies, with the servants who lived below and worked above, with the food bought at the market in the lower city. The boundaries between the upper and lower cities turned out to be an illusion. Mud knows no social classes. Bacteria don't check IDs. The Order of the Seven Springs doubled its sales of holy water. The lines at the stalls stretched for half a block. The price tripled. Novices in gray cloaks walked the streets with censers and recited prayers. They burned incense at the intersections. They delivered holy water to homes, free for the nobility, at double the price for everyone else. Dan watched this and said nothing. He couldn't shout in the square that they were charlatans. He couldn't prove it. Not yet, anyway. He needed more data, more time, more neighborhoods that weren't sick. He worked, every day, from morning till night. His hands grew rough. The calluses became as hard as the leather on his boots. His back got used to the shovel. A body that 6 months ago couldn't dig for an hour could now handle 10. He built. In the 4th week, a man from the king came to him. Not Sora, another. A young official in a blue doublet, with a document and a seal. He said that the royal physician, Sora Khan, had presented a report to the council on the neighborhoods with low mortality rates. The council rejected the report. The priests declared that the low mortality rate was due to the neighborhood's proximity to the consecrated spring on the eastern slope, that the ditches were irrelevant, that it was the holy water seeping through the earth and purifying the soil. Dan listened. He was silent. His jaw muscles twitched. The official continued. He said the council had rejected the report, but the king had read it, and the king wants to know more, not through the council, not through the priests, personally. The king invites Master Dan to an audience, in a month, when the fever subsides. Dan asked why in a month. The official said that the palace is currently under quarantine. No one is allowed in. The king is afraid of the contagion. Dan almost laughed. The king is afraid of the contagion and is sitting behind walls. But the contagion comes with the water that his servants bring him from those very wells. The walls are useless. Quarantine is useless, unless the source of the infection is sealed off. He didn't say that to the official. He said he would come in a month. The official left. Ada found out that same day. She came in the evening, agitated. For the first time in all the time Dan had known her, she didn't look calm. She said that an audience with the king was a chance, the only one. If Dan could convince the king, he'd get resources, people, money, the right to build throughout the city. If he couldn't convince him, the order would push for a ban, and then it would be over. Dan asked how to convince a man who believes in prayers. Ada said the king doesn't believe in prayers. The king believes in results. His daughter nearly died. His doctors are powerless. His mages are powerless. His priests are powerless. He spent half the treasury and nothing has changed. A man in that position is ready to listen. Dan nodded. He asked what he needed to bring to the audience. Ada said a map, numbers, and a bucket of water. Dan smiled. For the first time in 3 weeks. He said that a bucket of water was his specialty. For the remaining month of summer, they worked non-stop. Dan expanded the system to the 4th block. The 5th was in progress. Each new block went faster. Because the crew was learning. Because Lena could now mark out the ditches herself. Because Holt had taught 2 assistants how to dig properly. Because Meg explained the rules to new residents faster and more firmly than Dan ever could. The system grew not because Dan worked harder. The system grew because the people within it were getting better. They were learning, passing on knowledge. Everyone who passed through Dan's crew took that understanding with them. Water flows downhill. Dirt causes disease. Cleanliness saves lives. 3 simple rules. But for this world, it was a revolution. Summer ended. Scarlet fever receded. As always, with the first rains. The bodies were counted for a week. 812 people died in the lower city. 9 died in Dan's 5 blocks. 9 out of 812. 4 of the 9 were old people who didn't use filters. 3 were children under 2 years old. Too small, too weak. Dan couldn't save them. He remembered their names. 2 were adults. The man who drank from the gutter on the next street as he stumbled home drunk. The woman who washed her hands in dirty water out of habit. 9. He remembered each one. Knew every story. Knew he could have saved them if he'd started sooner. If there had been more hands. If there had been more time. If only people had listened. 9 against 800. That was the proof. Cold, hard, irrefutable. And in a week, he would carry it to the king. The palace stood on White Hill. Dan saw it every day, from anywhere in the lower city. White walls, towers with flags, windows that glowed gold at sunset. From a distance, it looked beautiful. Up close, it looked like a fortress. The walls were 3 paces thick. The gates were reinforced with iron. Guards in polished cuirasses stood at the entrance with halberds. Dan walked across the bridge over the dry moat. Ira walked beside him. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before. Dark blue. Simple, but expensive. The last nice dress from her past life. She held her back so straight it looked as if she had a steel rod inside her. Dan was in his work clothes. He wanted to put on something cleaner. Ira said no. She said he had to look like who he was. A builder. A man who works with his hands. Who digs the earth. That is his weapon. Not a doublet, not silk, dirt under his fingernails, calluses on his palms. That was his proof. Dan obeyed. He carried a bag. Inside the bag was a map, a large one, on a piece of leather that Moretta had begged from a tanner. Lena had been drawing it for 3 days, a map of the lower city, every block, every well, every cesspool. Dan's blocks were marked in one color, the rest in another. Next to each block was a number, the number of people who had died over the summer. There were 2 more buckets in the bag, small ones, clay ones, with lids, one with water from a lower city well, the other with filtered water. The guard at the gate looked at him as if he were an insect. Era showed a paper with the royal seal. They were let through. Inside, the palace was another world. Stone floors, tapestries, candles in silver candlesticks, the scent of wax and lavender. After 6 months in the lower city, Dan felt like a diver who had been pulled from the muddy depths to the surface. Too clean, too beautiful, too far from reality. They were led through the corridors, long ones, with portraits on the walls. Kings, queens, princes. They all looked the same, haughty, convinced that the world belonged to them. Dan walked and thought that not a single one of these people knew where the water from their palace outhouse flowed, and that it was precisely this ignorance that had been killing their subjects for hundreds of years. The throne room was large. The ceiling was lost in shadow. The windows were narrow. Light fell in columns in which dust floated. A throne stood on a dais. A man sat on the throne. Not old, not young, about 50, thin, with a beard that had once been well-groomed but was now beginning to turn gray unevenly. Sunken eyes, the eyes of a man who sleeps poorly. King Edwald III. People stood beside the throne, advisors, in fine clothes, with gold chains, with faces expressing varying degrees of boredom and suspicion. Among them stood a man in a white cloak with a silver 7-pointed star on his chest, a large one, not a novice, not a brother. It was the high priest, Cassian Orelski. Dan recognized the star. It was larger than Valden's, brighter. The man beneath it was tall, slender, with silver hair combed back, with a face that in another life would have been that of a professor or a conductor. Refined, intelligent, calm. He looked at Dan without hostility, with curiosity, like a scientist looking at an interesting specimen. Dan looked away. He turned to the king. Ira curtsied, deeply, properly. 15 years of court training in a single movement. Dan bowed, briefly, as best he could. The king looked at him. He was silent. Then he said he'd heard about him, that physician Khan had written a report, that the numbers were interesting. But numbers could be faked. He wanted to hear it from Master Dan himself, in his own words, what he was doing and why it worked. Dan set the bag on the floor, unfolded the map, spread it out right on the stone floor in front of the throne. The advisors leaned forward. Cassian didn't move. Dan knelt down next to the map, not out of respect, to demonstrate. He began to speak, simply, just as he'd spoken to Moretta on the first day, just as he'd spoken to Lena, just as he'd spoken to Meg and Holt. He said the city wasn't sick because of the gods or the spirits. The city was sick because of the filth. Dirt gets into the water. Water gets into people. People get sick. They die. He poked his finger at the map, pointed out the wells, pointed out the pits, showed how they were arranged, higher and lower down the slope, pointed out the arrows, the direction of the water in the ground, from top to bottom, always from top to bottom. He pointed out his districts, the ditches, the filters. He pointed out the numbers, 9 against 812. He spoke for 10 minutes, without pauses, without hesitation. He knew this material as well as he knew his own name, better than his own name in this world. When he finished, the room was silent. The king was looking at the map. One of the advisors cleared his throat. He said the numbers were impressive, but correlation doesn't prove causation, that perhaps Master Dan's plots were located in an area with better air, or closer to a blessed spring. Dan had been waiting for this. He took out the buckets, set them down nearby, opened the lids, asked the king to look. The king rose from his throne. He approached. He leaned over. In one bucket, the water was cloudy. It had an odor. It had a yellowish tint. In the other, it was clear, odorless, pure. Dan said that the first was from the usual well in the lower city. The second was from the same well, but had been filtered. He asked which bucket the king would like to drink from. The king was silent. He looked at the buckets, then at Dan. Cassian stepped forward, for the first time. His voice was soft, pleasant, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking before large assemblies. He said he respected Master Dan's work, that gutters were certainly useful for keeping the streets clean, but to link physical illnesses to water was a delusion. Illnesses stem from impurity of spirit, from sins, from a violation of the divine order. Holy water of the order of the 7 springs purifies not the body, but the soul. And through the purification of the soul, the body is healed. This is a 200-year-old teaching, confirmed by generations of believers. One man with a gutter cannot refute 200 years of faith. Dan listened. Cassian's voice was convincing, calm, logical within its own system. The man believed what he was saying. It was obvious. It wasn't a lie. It was ignorance. Sincere, deep, structural ignorance passed down from generation to generation. Dan stood up. He looked at Cassian. He said he respected faith, that he hadn't come to argue about gods, that he'd come to talk about water, and that he was proposing a simple test. Let the king choose 2 districts in the lower city, identical ones, in size, in population, in location. In one, Dan would build ditches and filters. In the other, the order would conduct its rituals. In a year, they would count the dead. Silence. Cassian smiled. He said that the divine cannot be tested like a commodity in the market. Dan replied that ditches can be, and that he was ready to stake his life on the result. If more people died in his district than in the order's district, Dan would leave the city, forever. If fewer, then the order would acknowledge his method, publicly. Cassian stopped smiling. The king sat back down on the throne. He rubbed his forehead. He said he would think about it, that this was a serious proposal, that he needed time. The audience was over. They were led out of the hall. In the corridor, Aira grabbed Dan by the elbow. Her hand was trembling. She said he was crazy, that you can't bet your life in front of the king. Dan said he wasn't betting his life. He was betting his certainty. He knows the ditches work. He as surely as he knows the sun rises in the morning. And that this conviction is stronger than any argument. Because Cassian can argue with numbers, but he can't argue with a man who's ready to die for what he believes in. Aira was silent. Then she said he was either a genius or an idiot, and that she hadn't decided yet. They left the palace. The sun was setting. Latran lay below, smoky, dirty, with 1,000 chimneys belching smoke, with 1,000 sewers reeking of filth, with 1,000 houses where people drank water that was killing them. Dan stood on the palace steps and looked down. He saw his neighborhoods, small, 5 islands of cleanliness in a sea of filth. That wasn't enough. He needed the whole city. He needed the king. He needed a mandate. He needed people and money and the right to build. And now it all depended on a single man with sunken eyes on a white throne. The answer came 10 days later. Not directly from the king, through Sora. She came at night, without a cloak, out of breath. She said the king had made a decision, not the one Dan had proposed, another one. The king would not hold a trial. He could not afford a quarrel with the order, but he would grant Dan a title, Master of Pure Water, a new title, coined specifically for this purpose, and with the title came a mandate, official permission to build ditches and filters in the lower city, at the treasury's expense. A limited budget, a small staff, but official, legal, protected. The order wouldn't be able to touch him openly, because the royal seal would stand behind him. Dan listened. He nodded. Then he asked one thing. He asked what Cassian had said. Sora replied that Cassian had no objections, publicly. He said he was glad for any help the city could get, that the order and Master Dan could work in parallel, that faith and craft were not at odds with one another. He was smiling when he said it. Sora said his smile was the scariest thing she'd seen at that council meeting. Dan understood. Cassian hadn't lost. Cassian had retreated, and a retreating enemy who smiles is more dangerous than one who advances. The mandate changed everything. Not immediately, not magically, but fundamentally. Before, Dan was a madman from the gutter. Now he was a master of pure water with a royal seal. The difference wasn't in what he did. The difference was in how people looked at him. People who had been twirling their fingers at their temples for 6 months were now bowing. Merchants who had refused to sell him lime on credit were now giving him a discount. Guards who could have arrested him as a vagrant now stepped aside. A seal on paper, ink on skin. It was worth more than 1,000 ditches. And that angered Dan the most, because he was the same man. He did the same things. He spoke the same words. But the words of a washerwoman and the words of a master with a seal are different words, even if the letters are the same. He didn't show his anger. He worked. Now he had a budget. Small, ridiculous by the yard standards. But for a man who had been building out of trash for free for 6 months, it was a fortune. He could hire people. He could buy materials. He could pay. The first thing he did, he hired Holt officially, with a salary. Holt became the first full-time employee of Velmeria's first ever sanitation department. He didn't know he was a sanitation worker. He knew he was being paid to dig ditches. That was enough. Second, he hired Meg. Not to dig, to supervise. She kept an eye on the finished ditches, checked the filters, scolded violators. She couldn't issue fines, but her voice, heard from 20 paces away, was more effective than any fine. Third, he began training. Not Lena. Lena already knew enough to mark out the ditches herself. He started teaching others. 4 young guys Holt had brought in. He explained the basics to them, what a slope is, how to check it with a bucket of water, how to place stones so the walls hold, how to make a clay plug. Simple things, but things no one in this town knew except his little group. Lena helped teach. She explained better than Dan because she spoke their language. Without the words Dan sometimes forgot and mispronounced. Without references no one understood. She spoke simply. She gestured with her hands. She drew on the ground. And the guys understood. A month later, Dan had 5 crews, 4 people each. Each could mark out a ditch on their own, dig it, line it with stones, cover it with slabs. Not perfect, but functional. He checked each one, walked through the finished sections, poured water on them, looked, corrected mistakes, showed how to do it better. He didn't scold, he showed. Because scolding kills initiative, and he needed initiative. He needed people to think for themselves, not just do what they were told, to understand why. By the start of the second year, 20 ditches were in operation in the train, 12 filters, 5 water closets. 2 of them were in the homes of nobles who had ordered them through Baron Wellington. The nobles were delighted, not by the hygiene, by the convenience. No need to walk across the courtyard to the cesspit at night. No need to keep a chamber pot. No stench. One of them, Count Marion, said at dinner that Master Dan's water closet was the best thing to happen to civilization since wine. The Count's words spread like wildfire. A week later, 3 orders from aristocrats arrived at Ira's. 2 weeks later, 5 more. People wanted water closets, not ditches. Ditches are filth. This is the lower city. This is for the poor. But a water closet is a luxury. It's technology. It's a topic of conversation at dinner. Dan understood this and took advantage of it. He built every water closet in a nobleman's house on one condition: a ditch from the house to the nearest drain, at the customer's expense. The nobleman wants a comfortable toilet. Fine. But a toilet only works if there's somewhere to drain the water, which means you need a sewer. And the sewer runs from his house through his neighbors' yards, which means the neighbors need a sewer too. And just like that, a single toilet for the Count turned into a 100-foot-long closed drainage system for an entire neighborhood. Era called it the toilet strategy. Dan called it common sense. At the same time, something happened that Dan hadn't planned on. He needed lime, a lot of lime, for mortar, for plaster, for disinfection. Buying it from merchants was expensive, even on a budget. He needed his own source, or a supplier, a cheap one, reliable, someone who could deliver 10 barrels of lime in 3 days, and copper for pipes, and clay, and everything else. Ada said she knew someone. Dan asked who. Ada said there was a woman in the harbor district, a smuggler. She knew all the supply channels, could get anything for a reasonable price. Dan asked why a smuggler. Ada said that legal suppliers are tied to the guilds. The guilds are tied to the council. The council is tied to the order. If Dan starts buying through the guilds, the order will know every purchase he makes, every route, every volume. But a smuggler operates outside all those chains. Dan agreed. They met in the harbor district, at a tavern on the corner, a dark one, with a low ceiling, smelling of fish and beer. A woman was sitting at a table in the corner, young, 26, black-haired, with a short haircut, with an earring in her left ear, with a scar on her right cheekbone, thin, old. She was slumped in her seat, feet up on the bench, a mug of beer in her hand. Her eyes were quick, appraising. She looked at Dan, then at Ira, then back at Dan. She said he was the very same master of the ditches. She said she'd expected someone bigger. Dan sat down. He said he needed lime, 10 barrels, in 3 days. She asked why she needed to know that. Dan said because he'd be paying, regularly, a lot, for a long time. And he needed someone who wouldn't cheat him or be late. She finished her beer, set down the mug, looked him in the eye. Her name was Jia Moon. Everyone called her Jia. She asked how much he was paying. Dan named his price. Jia laughed. She said that for that money, she'd get him half a barrel. Dan named another price. Gia stopped laughing. She said that for that money, 10 barrels would be ready in 2 days, not 3. They shook hands. Gia delivered 10 barrels in 1 day and 4 hours. Dan was impressed. A week later, he needed copper. For work. Gia got it in 2 days. A month later, he needed a special kind of clay, oily, from a quarry outside the city. Gia got it in 3 days. Every time, exactly what he needed. Right on time, right on price. Dan started discussing deliveries with her regularly. Not just what and how much. Where from, which route, through whom. Gia knew the city and its surroundings like the back of her hand. She knew every bridge, every road, every carrier, every guard who could be slipped past or bypassed. She traced routes on the table with her finger. Dan watched and saw logistics. Pure, beautiful, ruthless logistics of a person who had spent her whole life moving cargo past the law. He asked her once where she knew all this from. Gia said she'd grown up on the streets of the docks, that she'd been running with cargo since she was 10, that she knew every entrance and exit in Latraine by the time she was 12. She didn't say exactly where she'd grown up. Dan didn't ask. He knew from her eyes, from the way she sized up every man entered the tavern, by the way she sat with her back to the wall, by the scar on her cheekbone. He knew and didn't ask. He discussed routes with her, prices, volumes, like a professional, because she was a professional. 2 months later, Gia told him one thing. She said he was the first client who had never once tried to haggle by offering sex, who had never looked at her that way, who discussed delivery invoices with her, not her appearance. Dan said he was interested in Lime, not her personal life. Gia looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was strange. Dan said he heard that a lot. From that day on, Gia became more than just a supplier. She became part of the team. She delivered materials. She gathered information. She knew who was saying what in the port district, who was arriving, who was leaving, what rumors were circulating. She became his eyes and ears in the part of the city Dan couldn't reach himself. The team grew. People came. Not all out of conviction, many for the money. But even those who came for the money began to understand after a month of work. They began to see the connection between the gutter and health. They began to take pride in what they were doing. Dan saw this and said nothing. He didn't praise them. He didn't emphasize it. He simply gave the next assignment, a little harder, a little more important, a little more responsibility. And people rose to the challenge, upward. By the end of the first year, Dan had a small army, 40 people in 8 crews, 12 blocks under protection, 30 ditches, 20 filters, 11 outhouses, a soap kitchen in Meg's basement, the first in the lower city. Soap made from ash and fat, gray, stinky, but soap. Moretta handed it out to her neighbors. The first bar was free, the second at half price, the third at full price. By the fourth, they were buying it themselves, because they'd gotten used to it, because their hands didn't hurt after using the soap, because the children had stopped getting scabies. Habit, an engineer's most powerful tool. More powerful than a shovel, more powerful than calculation. Create a habit, and the system runs without you. Dan learned this in Portland. He applied it in Latraine. It worked the same way. The second summer came and went quietly. For Dan's blocks. Not for the rest of the city. Scarlet fever swept through the lower city again. Carts in the mornings again. Bundles again. Screams from the houses again. But in Dan's 12 blocks, it was quiet. Not perfectly quiet. 23 people died, all summer long, in all 12 districts. 23. In the rest of the lower city, 600 died. The numbers were irrefutable. Sora made a chart, a big one, on 3 sheets of paper, broken down by block, by age, by gender, by distance from the ditches. The closer a house was to a ditch, the lower the mortality rate. A linear relationship, clear, beautiful, merciless. She brought the table to the king personally. The king looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up, and Sora saw in his eyes something she had never seen before. Tears. The king was crying, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down his sunken cheeks and disappeared into his beard. He said one word. Why? Why hadn't anyone done this before? Why had his daughter nearly died? Why had thousands died? Why had the city stood in its own filth for 300 years, and no one had thought that filth kills? Sora didn't answer. She had no answer that wouldn't destroy everything. She couldn't tell the king that the answer lay in the silver star on his confessor's chest. Not yet. It wasn't time yet. The king wiped his face. He stood up. He said he wanted to see Master Dan. Now. Dan arrived 2 hours later. Dirty, wearing apron. They'd pulled him from the site where he was laying the foundation for a new section of the main sewer. The main sewer. It was the project of the year, the biggest, the most complex, the most important. One big pipe under the main street of the lower city, from the eastern gate to the river. 3,000 paces, 2 cubits wide, 1.5 deep, stone walls, a clay bottom, wooden beams above. All the neighborhood ditches were to flow into this pipe, like streams flowing into a river. All the city's drains down a single channel toward the river, below the city, downstream, where there are no wells, where there are no houses, where the mud will flow away with the water and never return. Dan designed it for 3 months. Lena drew the plans. Sora checked the calculations. Era negotiated with the homeowners along the route. Gia provided the materials. It was the first project in which the whole team worked together. Everyone in their place, everyone in their role. And it worked. Not smoothly. There were arguments, there were disputes. There were moments when Era and Gia looked at each other so intensely that the air between them crackled. The Baron's daughter and the smuggler. 2 women from different worlds. Both strong. Both sharp-tongued. Both used to being in charge. Dan diffused conflicts, not with wisdom, with work. When an argument started, he gave both of them a task, urgent, difficult, one that required them to cooperate. They argued. Then they got to work. Then they argued less. Then they got used to it. By the end of the year, Era and Gia hadn't become friends, but they had become partners. Each recognized the other's strength. That was enough. Dan stood before the king, in an apron, with dirt on his face. The king sat on the throne, not in the throne room, in a small room, a private one, without advisors, without priests, just him, and Sora by the wall. The king said he'd seen the numbers. That he understood, that he wanted to give more. Budget, people, authority. He wanted Dan to build a system for the entire lower city, not block by block, all at once. Dan said that for this, a main collector was needed. He explained about the pipe, about the route, about how all the ditches would merge into one, about how the city would stop drinking its own waste. The king listened. Then he asked how much it would cost. Dan named a figure. The king didn't flinch. He'd spent twice as much on mages from the neighboring empire, and they'd done nothing. He said he'd provide the money, and the people, 1,000 men, from the garrison, soldiers with nothing to do in peacetime. They would dig, under Dan's command. Dan thanked him. He stood up. He walked toward the door. The king called out. Dan turned around. The king said he had a daughter, Yvette, that she had been sick as a child, that she had survived, but had been frail ever since, that she read books, lots of books, that she had asked about Master Dan, that she wanted to talk to him, if Master Dan didn't mind. Dan said he didn't mind. He didn't know then that it would change a lot. Construction of the main sewer began 2 weeks later. 1,000 soldiers, under Dan's command, who commanded them like this, standing at the edge of the trench and pointing where to dig. The soldiers weren't used to a commander like that, small, dirty, without armor, without a sword, with a bucket of water and a board. The first day was chaos. The soldiers didn't know how to dig trenches. They knew how to march and thrust with a spear. Those are different skills. Dan put Holt in charge of the first company, Meg in charge of the second. He put Lena in charge of marking out the lines. She walked at the head of the column, with a rope and stakes, marking out the line, checking the slope, taking notes. 17 years old, a girl from the laundry, commanding 100 soldiers. They listened. Not because she was in charge, because she was the only one who knew where to drive the stakes. And without stakes, you can't dig. Knowledge is power, in the most literal sense. By the third day, the work was running smoothly. By the 10th, it was moving quickly. On the 20th day, Dan stood at the edge of the trench and watched as 1,000 men dug a single line from the eastern gate to the river. Straight, even, with the right slope, with stone walls, with a clay bottom. It was beautiful. Not aesthetically, functionally. It was the most beautiful ditch he had ever seen in his life, including both lives. While the construction was underway, Dan met Yvette, not in the palace, in the library. The palace library was located in a tower on the north side. Tall, narrow windows, shelves reaching the ceiling, dust and the smell of old paper. Dan had come to look for maps, old maps of the city. He needed to understand how the terrain had changed over the last 100 years, where ravines had been filled in, where new neighborhoods had been built, where the old riverbeds had run. The librarian showed him a shelf and left. Dan stood among the shelves and unrolled the scrolls, one after another. The maps were beautiful, illustrated, useless. Not a single one showed the terrain. Not a single one marked the slopes. Not a single one indicated where the wells were. The maps of this world were pictures, not tools. He sighed. He put down the scroll and heard a voice, quiet, from behind the shelf. The voice asked what he was looking for. Dan replied that he was looking for a topographic map, with elevations, with slopes. The voice was silent for a moment. Then it said there was one in the far cabinet, an old one, 200 years old. It was drawn by an engineer from the Eastern Empire, with elevation marks. No one knows what it means, but it exists. Dan walked around the shelf. Behind it stood a girl, short, pale, with dark hair, holding a book, with eyes that were too big for her thin face. She looked fragile, like something you handle with care. She looked at him without fear, with interest, the way one looks at a riddle one wants to solve. She said her name was Yvette. Dan nodded. He said his name was Dan. She said she knew, that she'd read Sora Khan's report, all of it, 3 times, that she had questions. Dan said he was ready to answer. Yvette pointed to a cabinet in the far corner. Inside lay a map, an old one, on yellowed paper, with contour lines, with markers, with numbers. Dan unfolded it and froze. It was a topographic map, rough, approximate, but topographic, with contour lines, with elevation markers in local units. 200 years ago, someone in this world knew how to do this. 200 years ago, when the order appeared. Dan looked at Yvette. He asked who had drawn this map. Yvette said the name was on the back. Dan turned it over. The name was foreign, long, written in a script he didn't recognize. But beneath the name was a note, Master of Waters. 2 words, in a language that didn't exist in this world. Dan read them, and realized the note was in English. Dan stood with the map in his hands as the world shifted. 2 words in English, Watermaster, written in a handwriting that could have belonged to anyone, 200 years ago. Someone from his world had been here. Someone who knew what contour lines were, what elevation marks were, what topographic surveying was. Someone who had come before, and left behind a map in the library and an order that was tormenting the city. Yvette stood nearby. She saw his face, asked if everything was all right. Dan placed the map on the table, carefully, like placing evidence. He said he was fine. He asked what she knew about this man. Yvette knew a little. A name, Master Silas. That's what they called him in the chronicles. He appeared in Latran 200 years ago. No one knew where he came from. He spoke with an accent no one could place. He knew things no one else knew. He brought with him knowledge of water, of minerals, of poisons. He founded a brotherhood that later became the Order of the 7 Springs. He built 7 wells on the hill. He declared them sacred. The water from them was sold as medicine. He lived in Latraine for 30 years. He died rich, respected, almost a saint. Yvette told this in an even voice. She read a lot. She knew the Chronicles by heart. For her, it was history, ancient, distant. For Dan, it was a blow to the chest. A man from his world had come here with the same knowledge, with the same understanding of water, soil, slopes, filtration, and instead of saving the city, he poisoned it. Because he understood what any businessman understands. A cure brings money once. A disease brings money forever. A monopoly on a cure only works if the disease doesn't disappear. And if you control both the disease and the cure, you control everything. Dan sat down at the table. Yvette sat across from him. The library was empty. Just them, the shelves, and dust in the beams of light. Dan couldn't tell her the truth. Not all of it. Not now. He said that this master, Silas, knew more about water than anyone else in the world, and that he used that knowledge not for salvation, but for power. Yvette nodded. She said she'd suspected as much, that there were strange passages in the Order's Chronicles, descriptions of rituals that didn't resemble prayers, more like recipes, exact quantities, specific minerals, a certain time of day. She showed him, pulled a notebook from behind a shelf, hers, handwritten, with excerpts from the Chronicles, with notes in the margins. The princess who sat in the tower and read forbidden books turned out to be a researcher, a quiet one, meticulous, inconspicuous. She had been collecting data for years, not because she suspected the Order, because she was curious, because the numbers didn't add up, because holy water didn't work, but they told her it did, and she couldn't accept that. Dan leafed through the notebook, neat handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, names, quantities. She had tracked when the Order performed rituals, when outbreaks of the disease began after them, when they ended. The correlation was frightening. Every major outbreak of red fever over the past 50 years began 2 to 4 weeks after a major ritual of the Order. Every single one, without exception. Dan closed the notebook. He set it on the table. He looked at Yvette. She was looking at him, waiting. He said she needed to talk to Sora Khan, that Sora had mortality data, that if they combined Sora's data with Yvette's, they would have proof, not circumstantial, direct. Yvette asked what proof of what? Dan paused. Then he said that the Order wasn't healing the city. The Order was poisoning it. Yvette didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't turn any paler than she already was. She nodded, quietly, like someone who had long suspected it and had finally heard confirmation. She said that when she was 9 years old, she had been delirious with fever, that the priests stood around her and recited prayers, that they gave her holy water to drink, that after the holy water she felt worse, that it wasn't the Order that saved her. She was saved by an old wet nurse who disobeyed orders and gave her plain, boiled water from the palace well on the upper tier. Clean, without additives. Without blessings. And she felt better. But the priests recorded it as a miracle, as the mercy of the gods, as the result of prayers. And she knew her whole life that it was a lie. But she couldn't prove it. Dan listened. He saw before him a girl who had carried the truth within her for 10 years and couldn't speak it, because the truth against the Order is heresy. And heresy for a princess isn't a stake, it's a convent, forever. He told her one thing. He said that it wasn't prayer that saved her, not the gods, not a miracle. She was saved by a strong body and clean water. But those who prayed nearby and drank holy water were saved by nothing. Because prayer doesn't kill bacteria, and clean water doesn't let them multiply. Yvette was silent, for a long time. Then a wave washed over her face. Not tears, something deeper. Something that had been building up for 10 years. Relief, so intense it felt like pain. She said she'd felt indebted her whole life, indebted to the gods who saved her, indebted to the Order that prayed for her, indebted and guilty, because the others prayed just as fervently, and they died. So she was saved not for her merits, on a whim, on a caprice, by chance. And that chance was unbearable. If the gods save by chance, then they are cruel. And if they are cruel, then they do not deserve prayers. And not to pray means to betray those who saved you. A vicious circle. 10 years. Dan said that the circle was broken, that the gods neither saved nor killed, that it was water, just water. Dirty water kills. Clean water gives a chance. No will, no whim. Physics, chemistry, biology. Things that don't depend on prayers. Yvette finally cried. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Dan sat beside her. He was silent. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He was just there. After a minute, she stopped. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She looked at him. She said she wanted to help, that her notebook, her notes, her access to the chronicles, everything was at his disposal. Dan nodded. He said he appreciated it more than she thought, and that he needed one thing from her. Not the notes, not the data. Silence. No one must know that the princess is helping the master of the sewers, for now. Because if the order finds out that Yvette is digging under them, she'll face more than just the monastery. Yvette nodded. She said she knew how to keep quiet. 10 years of practice. Dan left the library with a map and an understanding that changed everything. He now knew that scarlet fever wasn't natural, that the order had been poisoning the city for 200 years, that the order's founder was just as much of an outsider as he was, that this world summons people from another world when the balance is disrupted, that 200 years ago, the one who created the disease had come, and now the one who must stop it had arrived. He didn't feel chosen. He felt tired and angry. Angry at the man who could have saved thousands, but instead killed them. For money, for power, for a comfortable life in a world where no one could challenge him. Dan walked through the palace corridors and thought about Silas, about himself, about what distinguishes one outsider from another. The knowledge is the same. The opportunities are the same. The difference lies in the choice. Silas chose himself. Dan chose Moretta Street. He left the palace. He walked down the steps. Ira was standing below, waiting. She asked how it went. Dan said it was interesting, that he'd tell her tonight. That right now he needed to get to the construction site. Because Holt had reported that morning that the soil was soft at the site by the river. The walls were shifting. The structure needed to be changed. They needed to put in wooden supports. They needed to recalculate. Era nodded. She wasn't offended. She knew that for Dan, the construction site always came first. Everything else came later. He walked down, toward the river, toward the trench, toward the 1,000 people digging his sewer line. Halfway there, Gia intercepted him. She was standing by the bridge, serious, without her usual smirk. She said there was a problem. Last night, people had been seen near the warehouses on Port Street, in gray raincoats. They were asking about lime deliveries, who was buying, how much, where it was being taken. The order was looking for Dan's supply channels. Gia said she'd rerouted the shipments, that the next shipment would go through the north gate instead of the port, that they needed to change the route every 2 weeks, otherwise they'd be tracked down. Dan nodded. He thanked her. Gia looked at him. She asked if everything was okay. He looked different, paler, more focused. Dan said he was fine, that he'd found out something. He'd tell her when he had time. Gia didn't press him. She turned and left, quickly, silently, as was her habit. Dan reached the trench. He climbed down. He looked at the soft soil. He touched the wall. It was damp, bendy. It gave way under his hand. A classic problem. Water-saturated soil. Piles are needed, or a wooden frame, or both. He called for Lena. She came with her notes. They sat on the edge of the trench, dangled their legs, started calculating. How much wood was needed? What size? How to secure it? Lena sketched on a scrap of leather, quickly, confidently. The lines were straight, the numbers were clear. Dan looked at her drawing and saw an engineer, not a student, not an apprentice, an engineer. One who lacked experience, but who had everything else: brain, eye, hand, understanding. He told her she would design this section herself. Lena looked up. She looked at him. He said he would check it, but she would design it, by herself. Lena didn't smile. She nodded. She took a new scrap of paper and began to sketch. 3 hours later, she brought him the plan. A wooden frame, piles every 5 feet, crossbeams, board siding on the inside, clay joint compound. Dan looked it over, found one mistake. The piles were too far apart for this type of soil. They needed to be every 3 feet, not 5. He told her. He showed her why. Lena corrected it. No hard feelings, no upset, with attention. She remembered. She wrote it down. 3 feet, not 5, for soft soil. A week later, the site was ready, according to her design, with her correction. It worked. Water flowed, the walls held. Dan stood nearby and watched, and he thought that someday Lena Holloway would build a bridge, a real one, a stone one, across the river. And that would be the best day of his life, including both. The main collector was completed in early fall of the second year, 3,000 paces from the eastern gate to the river, stone walls, a clay bottom, wooden beams. 28 side ditches flowed into it like tributaries. Dan stood by the outlet on the riverbank and watched as the brown water poured from the pipe into the current, below the city, below the wells, below the people. The filth was gone. For the first time in 500 years, the filth of Latrana was flowing to a place where it could kill no one. Holt stood nearby, silent. He was always silent. But there was something new in this silence. Something resembled pride. He had dug this sewer from the first day to the last. His hands had done more than the hands of any other man on this construction site. Dan turned to him, said that without him, nothing would have been possible. Holt shrugged, said he'd just been digging. Dan said that was exactly what was needed. Dig. Right. In the right place. To the right depth. And that it was more important than any title. Holt didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched. For Holt, that was a smile. The next day, Dan opened the first public bathhouse in Lower City. Not alone, together with Moretta. The bathhouse was simple, a stone building, a former warehouse that Ira had haggled for from the city council for a nominal fee. Inside, 3 rooms. The first for men, the second for women, the third for laundry. Water was supplied from a well on the hill, through a filter, heated in wood-fired boilers. It drained through a system of pipes into a sump, a closed loop. Clean water goes in, dirty water goes out. Soap lay in piles by the entrance, gray, from Meg's soap factory, rough. But soap. The first day was free. Dan stood at the entrance. People approached, cautiously, with suspicion. Many had never washed themselves completely. Some hadn't washed in years. The smell from the line was so strong that Dan breathed through his mouth. But he stood there, and smiled, and told everyone that it was warm and safe inside. The children went in first. They're always the first. They're not afraid. Curious. They came running out half an hour later, wet and squealing, red from the hot water, clean. Their mothers watched and didn't recognize them. Then the women went in. Then the men. By evening, more than 100 people had passed through the bathhouse. At the end of the day, an old man came in. Dan didn't know his name. Thin, hunchbacked, in clothes that had once been clothes. Now they were layers of rags held together by mud and time. He stood at the entrance, hesitating to go in. Moretta walked up to him, took his hand. She led him inside. An hour later, he came out, clean, in a simple canvas shirt that Moretta had pulled from a stack against the wall, a spare, for those who had nothing to wear. The old man stood in the doorway. His skin was pink from the hot water, his hair was white. Beneath the grime, it was white. He stood there and cried. Tears streamed down his clean cheeks. He said he smelled like a human being again. Dan stood nearby. He turned away. He couldn't watch. Not because it was unpleasant, because it was too much, all at once. Moretta saw. She walked over, stood beside him, silently took his hand. Not his elbow, his hand. Her palm was rough, warm, strong. Dan didn't pull his hand away. They stood like that for a minute. Then Moretta said she needed to close the bathhouse. Evening. The firewood was running out. Tomorrow was a new day. Dan nodded. They closed the bathhouse. They went home. On the way, Moretta said she wanted to talk. They walked down the street. Down a clean street. Down a street that a year ago was drowning in mud. Now the cobblestones were visible. The ditch was covered. The filter was working. The air didn't stink. Moretta said that when she picked him up out of the mud a year ago, she thought he was crazy. That his ramblings about water and ditches were the ravings of a sick man. She let him into the house because he was pitiful, dirty, skinny. Like a stray dog. Not because she believed him, because she felt sorry for him. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. Moretta continued. She said that later she saw those he had named die, in those houses, in those days, and how those who listened to him didn't die, and something inside her broke. No, it didn't break. It came together. For the first time in 3 years since her husband's death, something inside her came together as a whole. Because a man had appeared who knew why Tom had died. Not because of the gods, not because of fate, because of water. From specific water, from a specific well. And that means Tom didn't die because he deserved it. Not because he prayed too little. Not because she was a bad wife. But because no one knew about the water. And now someone knows. And is digging ditches so the next Tom won't die. She stopped, turned to him, said she didn't know what to call it. Not love, not gratitude, something in between, something more, like the ground you stand on. You don't think about it every day, but without it, you fall. Dan stood on a clean street in the city he was changing and looked at the woman who was the first in this world to believe that water flows down. He said he understood, that for him too it was something in between, that he didn't know how to speak beautifully about such things, that he's an engineer, that he'd be better at showing it. Moretta asked what he would show. Dan said he'd show her tomorrow, that he had a project for her house. Moretta laughed, for the first time all evening. She said he was the only man in the world who talks to a woman about feelings and then immediately shifts the conversation to sewers. Dan said not to sewers, to the water closet. Moretta laughed all the way home. The following weeks were filled with work. The bathhouse was open every day. People flocked to it from all over Lower Town. Not from Dan's neighborhoods, from far away. They walked halfway across town to wash. Meg ran the bathhouse. She hired 3 women to help. She set rules, strict ones. Wash your hands before entering. Don't spit in the water. Don't do laundry in the bathhouse. She personally kicked out violators, by the collar, regardless of size. The bathhouse became a hub. Not just a place to wash, a place for conversation, for news, for exchange. People came to wash and stayed to talk. And in those conversations, a new word emerged. Cleanliness. Not divine, not spiritual, physical, simple. Soap and water, hands and body. A small word, but it changed mindsets, slowly, one person at a time. Dan, meanwhile, started the project he'd been afraid of. A school. Not a real school, a room in the bathhouse basement. Benches, a blackboard made of planed wood, chalk. He taught. Not children, adults. Men and women from the work crews, those who dug ditches, those who installed filters, those who maintained the collector. He taught them what he knew: slopes, filtration, boiling, hand washing, the connection between dirt and disease. Simple things, but things on which life depends. Lena taught arithmetic, counting, adding, subtracting, measuring, writing down. Sora came once a week. She talked about the body, about how the stomach works, about what happens when dirt gets into it. She spoke simply, no jargon, no technical terms, with examples, with drawings on the blackboard. The students listened, mouths agape. For them, the world was opening up anew. A world in which illness is not a punishment, but cause and effect. A world in which one can protect oneself, not with prayer, with knowledge. It was the first school for medics in the history of Velmeria. 12 students, a wooden blackboard, chalk, and a man from another world who explained why you need to wash your hands after using the outhouse. 12. In a year, there will be 100. In 5 years, 1,000. In 20 years, every city in the kingdom will have its own sanitation worker. Dan wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about tomorrow's lesson, about how to explain what a siphon is without using the word siphon. The second summer of the second year. Scarlet fever had arrived, as always, with the heat, with the flies, with the stench rising from those neighborhoods where there were no sewers yet. But this time it was different. 3/4 of the lower city was under Dan's system. 28 neighborhoods out of 36. Ditches, filters, a sewer, soap, boiling rules, hand-washing rules. The 8 remaining neighborhoods were on the outskirts, by the western wall. The system hadn't reached there yet. It was just like before. Open drains, dirty wells, flies, the stench. The fever hit them hard. 40 people died in the first week, another 30 in the second. Dan reassigned 3 crews to emergency construction. They dug ditches, they installed filters, they handed out soap, they explained, boil your water, wash your hands, don't drink from that well. They were running late. A ditch isn't dug in a day, a filter doesn't purify water instantly. Habits don't change on command. People in the western neighborhoods were scared, but they did what they always did. They prayed, they burned herbs, they bought holy water. They were dying. Dan walked through the western neighborhoods. He saw the sick, he saw the dying. He saw children with red spots and cloudy eyes, and he couldn't do anything. He couldn't cure them. He could only build, faster, more, but not fast enough. Lena was with him. She saw it too. She didn't cry. She was marking out lines, faster, more precisely, marking out ditches, calculating gradients, driving in stakes, working 16 hours a day. One evening, Dan found her by the wall. She was sitting on the ground, a pencil in her hand, a drawing on her lap. She wasn't moving. He approached. She was asleep, sitting up, with a pencil in her hand. He carefully took the drawing, looked at it, finished, correct, no mistakes. She had finished her work and fallen asleep the very same second. He covered her with his apron, called Holt. Holt carried her home, to Moretta. Dan stayed on the site, alone. He stood in the dark. He looked at the unfinished ditch, and he calculated. If the full crew comes out tomorrow, they'll finish this section in 2 days. If they finish, 20 houses will get clean water. If they get it, maybe 10 children won't get sick. Maybe. He wasn't sure. He was never sure. He knew the statistics. He knew the probabilities. He knew that ditches reduce mortality by a factor of 10. But 10 times isn't 0. 10 times means that someone will still die. And he didn't know who. And he couldn't choose. He could only build and hope he'd make it in time. Summer was over. The tally took a week. Sora did the counting herself, with Iveta. They sat in the library and tallied the numbers. The result was this. In Dan's 28 districts, 87 people died over the summer. Of those, 52 were in the districts that had been connected to the system during the epidemic. In the 8 districts without the system, 112 died. Total mortality in Lower City, 199. Last year, 812. A year ago, over 1,000. The difference was so stark that Sora reread her notes 3 times. Then she showed them to the king. The king stood by the window. He looked out at the city for a long time. Then he turned, and in full view of Sora, the advisors, and the guards, he stepped out onto the balcony. He stood at the railing, and he wept. Without hiding, without turning away, he stood on the balcony above his city and wept. The guards below saw him. Passers-by saw him. Servants saw him. No one knew why the king was weeping, but everyone remembered. Then they found out, and remembered it even more vividly. The Order of the Seven Springs reacted to the figures in its own way. Cassian requested an audience with the king. He was granted one. He came with his 3 older brothers. He spoke for an hour. His arguments were as follows. Mortality did not drop because of the ditches. Mortality dropped because the Order intensified its prayers. Because last summer they performed a great ritual of purification. Because the stars were aligned favorably. Because the gods took pity. Master Dan's ditches are just a coincidence. Correlation is not causation. The king listened. He was silent. Then he asked one question. He asked why, in the 8 districts without ditches, where prayers were recited exactly the same way, the mortality rate remained the same. Cassian fell silent for 3 seconds. Then he said that the western districts were historically less pious, that sinners lived there, that the gods punished the unfaithful. The king looked at him for a long time. Then he said the audience was over. Cassian left. Sora, who was standing by the wall, saw his face as he walked out. It was calm. That was worse than anger. Calmness meant a plan. That same week, the attacks began. Not on the filters, on people. The first victim was a guy from the 3rd Brigade. He was beaten up at night, on the street, by 2 masked men, silently, professional. They broke his arm, left him lying there. He didn't see their faces, didn't hear their voices. 2 days later, there was a fire at Gia's warehouse, at night. 3 barrels of lime and a 2-week supply of wood burned down. Gia was furious. She knew her warehouses, knew the fire couldn't have started on its own. Arson. Clean, neat, professional. 3 days later, a man approached Dan on the street, a stranger. He said quietly that Master Dan should be more careful, that Latran was a dangerous city, that accidents happened often, especially to those who meddled in things that weren't their business. And he left. Dan told the team. He gathered everyone in Moretta's laundry room. It was cramped. Moretta, Lena, Era, Sora, Gia, Holt, Meg, everyone. He said the Order had resorted to outright violence, that this meant they were afraid. If they're afraid, it means the system is working, that the ditches threaten their power, their money, their position. If people stop getting sick, they'll stop buying holy water. If they stop buying it, the Order will lose its influence. If it loses influence, it loses everything. He said he understands if anyone wants to leave, that it's dangerous, that a broken arm for one person could be a broken neck for another, that he has no right to demand people risk their lives for the ditches. Silence. Holt said he isn't going anywhere. Short and sweet, as always. Meg said let them try to come near her bathhouse. She'll show them how to break arms. Gia said she has friends at the port who can keep an eye on the warehouses and on a few other things. Ira said she'll talk to people at court, that the Order has enemies among the aristocrats, who have long been waiting for an excuse. Sora said she'd record every incident, document it, for the king. Lena said she'd be at the site tomorrow morning as usual, with a pencil, with a rope, with stakes. And she asked someone to walk her home because she's 17 and it's scary to walk alone at night now. Moretta hugged her daughter. Dan looked at them, at everyone. At the people who, a year ago, had been strangers: the laundress, the digger, the tanner's wife, the baron's daughter, the royal physician, the smuggler, and the girl with the pencil. His team, his family. They hadn't gone anywhere, and neither had he. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.